I want to tell you about something I watched happen at my school. And I want to be careful how I tell it because these are real kids involved and they deserve their privacy. And it's FERPA laws. So I'm just going to be vague on the specifics, no details. But the pattern is real. Students were pressuring other students. This is years ago to fight, not fighting themselves, but bait them, organize it, you know, taking their phones out, talking to kids into swinging at another kid, then standing there with their phones out just to record the whole thing. Now, here's the part where I need you to sit with because it took me a while to understand that it was actually something I was looking at. Those fights did not happen and then get recorded. They happened because they could be recorded. They were recording was not documentation, it was the reason. The audience was the reasons. The views and the clicks were the reason. Take away the phone, and a meaningful number of those fights never happened at all because the whole thing had no payoff. Um, I can confidently say because I made this policy, my school has an extremely rare event of any physical confrontation, and that is because of the policy that I put into place. Um, I also had students cheating on exams with their phones hidden under desks and finding creative ways in their sleeves and the smartwatches also. So that one is more familiar and it's real, and we will talk about that as well. But it's not the story that changed how I think. And here's why this matters right now. 26 states have laws requiring schools to restrict or ban phones. 22 of those laws passed in 2025 alone. New Jersey's statewide ban takes in effect this September. Utah's took effect July 1st. Districts all over this country are rolling out policies this very month. And nearly all of that conversation is framed the same way. Phones are a distraction. They steal the attention from the lesson. One expert compared to teaching a class where students are on the phones to trying to teach at Disney World over a loudspeaker. And that is a good line, and it's true. It's also too small. Distractions means a student had attention and something took it. What I watched was different. The phone was not competing with the lesson for the attention. The phone was creating an incentive to hurt another child. That is not a distraction problem. That is an incentive problem. And it's much bigger one. I run a charter school in Florida. Florida passed the first school phone ban in the country in May 2023. And I had already written and implemented a policy at my school before the state told me I had to. So I have watched this play out longer than almost anyone talking about it publicly. And what I've learned is that the ban itself is not the thing that determines whether it works. It's much more than that. We're going to discuss that today. I'm Mike Aponte, also known as M.A. Aponte, and this is Thinking to Think. Guys, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps out the algorithm and the internals of this podcast. So I really appreciate it. This is something I'm passionate about. So please give it a like, a thumbs up, 5 stars, whatever you're listening to. And I really appreciate it. So let me give you the landscape before I give you my opinion, because that's how we do it here. Florida went first in May 2023. Since then, this has moved faster than almost any education policy in recent memory, aside from the AI that I discussed in my previous episode. 26 states now have laws requiring districts to ban or limit phone use. 22 of those were enacted in 2025 alone. This is not a trend, this is a stampede. The strictest version is what people call a bell to bell ban, which means exactly how it sounds. From the first bell to the last bell, phones are off and stored and inaccessible. Not away during class and out at lunch, gone for the entire day. States with the bell to bell laws include Texas, New York, Virginia, Louisiana, Alabama, and Nebraska. Utah took effect on July 1st of this year. And Governor Spencer Cox said he is convinced a bell to bell ban is the simple, most important thing states can do for students right now. Other states, including California, Minnesota, and Ohio, requires districts to create a policy but leave the specifics local. Hold on to that distinction because it matters enormously, and we are coming back to that. New Jersey passed a bipartisan bill requiring every district in the state to restrict phones, tablets, and smartwatches taking effect this 26-27 school year. Indiana's laws require devices powered off, stored, and inaccessible for the entire school day. The public is on board with this. Pew Research found in 2025 that 74% of American adults support banning middle and high school students from using phones during class, up from 68% the year before. Support for banning phones for the entire school day rose from 36% to 44%. So this is not a partisan fight. It is one of the few education issues in America right now with genuine bipartisan agreement. Teens are notably less enthusiastic, for obvious reasons, which would not surprise anyone who has met a teenager, or in my case, worked with teenagers. And here are some early evidence. Paul Peterson at the Harvard Kennedy School, who has spent his career on education policy, says early evidence suggests that there may be long term benefits for learning outcomes and for absenteeism. Teachers in districts that have implemented consistently report better focus, more participation, and fewer disruptions. But researchers are also clear that the long term academic studies do not exist yet. We are 3 years into this. Anyone telling you that the data is settled is overselling it. And here's the number nobody is talking about right now. A 2025 study out of University of Southern California found that despite the widespread adoption of phone restrictions and despite broad public support for them, compliance remains uneven. Most students continue to use their phones during the school day regardless of the restrictions. I'm going to read that again. Most students, and when I say read that, I mean the subtitles, most students continue to use phones regardless of the restrictions. 26 states passed laws. 2.5 million students are using magnetic locking pouches. New York allocated $29 million to New York City schools alone for this, roughly $35 per student. And most students are still on their phones. This finding the whole episode is about because it tells you that passing the ban and having the ban work are two entirely different things. Something that I mentioned about in my previous episode regarding AI. And the gap between them is not about the law. It's about what happens inside the buildings, inside every classroom, every single day. Before we talk about why bans fail, I want to correct the framing because if you misdiagnose the problem, you will design the wrong solution. And that is exactly what a lot of distractions are doing right now. From what I have observed running a building, phones created three distinct problems. They are not the same problem, and they do not respond to the same fix. Problem one, attention, the one everybody knows. This is the distraction argument, and it's completely real. A student cannot be in a lesson and then a group chat at the same time. Attention does not split cleanly. Researchers call this divided attention, and its finding is consistent s- when you split focus between two tasks. You do both of them worse than if you did either one alone. Every teacher listening to this has watched a student eyes drop to their lap mid sentence. You lose them. You spend energy getting them back. You do that 40 times a day. That's exhausting, and it's genuinely bad for learning. Not to mention, and their studies have proven this, and I actually discussed this in one of my previous episodes about how it takes time once the brain is distracted from a task to refocus and re-engage. We may assume by the physicality that we have re-engaged, but the brain has to catch up with the body and where the focus lies. And this is a problem that is the national conversation is built around. And if this were the only problem, then honestly, a simple ban might be enough. But this is not the only problem. Problem two, integrity, the one everybody underestimates. I've had students cheat on exams with phones under the desk, up a sleeve, in a waistband, screenshots of notes, photos of the test passed in the next period. Here's what makes this harder than people think. When a phone is involved, cheating stops being an individual act, it becomes a distribution network. One student photographs an exam, and within an hour, every student who takes it later that day has seen it. The scale is completely different from a kid glancing at excuse me, a neighbor's paper. And notice how this connects to what we talked about in the AI episode um, in the last week. Same underlying question: is the student doing the thinking, or is the student routing around the thinking? Different tool, identical problem. Problem three: incentive, the one almost nobody names. And this is the one I opened with, and it's the one that changed how I think about the entire issue. Students pressure other students into physical fights or other viral moments that is trending on social media so they can record it. Now, think carefully what's happening there. The phone is not stealing the attention from the lesson. The phone is supplying a motive that did not previously exist. There is now a reason to cause a fight, as my example, that has nothing to do with the fight itself. The reason is the footage. The reason is the audience. Economists have a term for this. When someone changes what a behavior is rewarded, they call it an incentive structure. And when the reward for a behavior goes up, you have more of the behavior. Okay. That is one of the most reliable findings in all of school science. A camera in every pocket, connected to an audience of thousands or millions, changes what is rewarded inside the school building. It makes cruelty profitable in a currency teenagers care about enormously, which is attention. This is why you see viral videos when you see in a school bus a situation where a poor child is being brutally beaten and you see the recording from the beginning to the end. That was not an accident. That was preparation. This is why I think the distraction framing is dangerously incomplete. If phones only stole attention, a phone ban would be an academic policy. Because phones also restructure incentives, a phone ban is a safety policy. And those two things deserve very different levels of seriousness, very different enforcement, and very different consequences. When I hear that a district debating whether phones can come out at lunch, I think about the fact that lunch is exactly when those fights happen. So let's ask the bigger question, why bans fail? And 26 states legislating and millions of dollars spent and pouches in the classroom all over the country. Are most students still on their phones? And I have a direct answer. And it comes from writing a policy before anyone made me and then living with it. Failure one, the rule has holes. A policy that says phones are away during instructional time has a hole in it. And students will find the hole before the end of the first week. Between classes counts, lunch counts, study hall counts. Any moment the rule goes quiet, in a moment students learn the rule is situational. And once the rule is situational, it is not a rule anymore. It's a suggestion with a schedule. This is the real argument for bell to bell that most coverage misses. Bell to bell is not stricter for the sake of being strict. It is stricter because it removes ambiguity. There's no judgment call, no gray zone, no negotiation. Often stored all day, a rule with no holes is easier to follow and easier to enforce, which is why it survives contact with a real school. Failure two, inconsistent enforcement kills it instantly. This is a big one. This is the one I would put in bold if I could say things in bold out loud, with the exception of screaming. If your policy is not enforced identically by every adult in the building, it is dead, not weakened, dead. Here's why. Students map a building faster than any administrator can. Within days, they know which teacher enforces and which teachers lets it slide, which hallway has coverage and which does not, which adult will write it up and which will just sigh. And the moment there is one adult who does not enforce, that classroom becomes the place phones come out. But if it does not stop there, because now every student in the building knows the policy is not real, it is just something certain adults happen to care about. And the rule that certain adults happen to care about carries no weight anymore. One teacher who does not enforce does not create one weak classroom. It creates a weak school. And I want to say clearly that this is usually not a discipline problem with teachers. It's a leadership problem. If I have not trained my staff back then when they enforced it, made the expectation unmistakable, and taken the burden off them when a parent escalates, then inconsistent enforcement is my failure, not theirs. The enforcement is exhausting when you feel alone in it. My job is to make sure no adult in that building is enforcing alone. Failure three, there are no real consequences. A verbal warning is not a consequence, it is a comment. If a student can violate the policy repeatedly and the only thing that happens is an adult says something, then the policy costs them nothing. And things that cost nothing do not change behavior. This is not cynicism about kids. I want to make that clear. This is how humans work at every age. Consequences have to be real, they have to escalate. And critically, they have to actually happen. The most common failure I see is a policy with beautiful escalating consequences written into it that nobody executes because executing them is a hassle. A consequence that exists on paper and never in practice is worse than having no consequences written at all, because now the students have proof the document is theater. And here's where I will be honest about the hardest part of this job. Real consequences generate parent phone calls, every one of them. If a school leader is not prepared to absorb that, the policy will quietly soften until the calls stop. This is how most phone policies actually die, not in a board vote. It's in a slow retreat nobody announces. Failure 4, removing the phone is not teaching the skill. This is different from the other three because it's not about whether the ban works, it's about what the ban is for. A student who spent 4 years in a building where phones were impossible has not learned self-regulation. They have been in an environment where the choice was removed. Then they graduate, and then 18 with a phone in their pocket and nobody's taking it, they are exactly where they were at 14, except now the stakes are a job, a degree, and a license. A researcher at Virginia Tech put it this way. She said she will not teach students to self-regulate phone use, not just for their time in school, but for the workforce, for higher education, for the military, for whatever comes next. I had a staff member who was more on their phone than teaching the class. That's a problem. Now, I want to be careful here because this argument gets misused. Some people say we should teach responsible use instead of banning. And I think that is wrong. And I think it is wrong because for a specific reason. You cannot teach self-regulation in an environment that is actively hostile to it. Asking a 14-year-old to self-regulate against an application engineered by hundreds of adults to be maximally difficult to put down is not teaching. It's setting them up to fail and then calling the failure a character flaw. So it is both. Remove the phone, which creates an environment where focus is possible, and separately, deliberately, teach the skill so that when the environment stops protecting them, they have something. Not either or both in that order. And here's the Bell test. So here's the framework, 4 questions. If you're a school leader, run this on your policy before the school starts. If you're a parent, ask these at your first school meeting. If you're a teacher, this tells you whether you have been handed something real. I call it Bell, Bell, because everybody is already saying bell to bell, so the word is doing work. Boundary, enforcement, leveraging, learning. Boundary, does the rule have holes? The question, is this rule absolute, or does it have gaps students find? Write the rule out. Then ask, what does this rule go quiet? Between classes, at lunch, in the library, on the bus, every gap is a place where students learn the rule. It's situational, and situational rule has no authority anywhere. The test, can a student describe the rule in one sentence with no exceptions? If they need an if or an except, you have holes. E, enforcement. Does every adult enforce it identically? The question, is the rule enforced the same way by every adult in the building every time? Not most adults, not most of the time, every adult, every time, because students will find one exception within days of the entire policy. Will deflate from that one point. And leaders, be honest with this one, because there is a second question underneath it. Have I trained my staff, backed them publicly, and made it clear that enforcing this is not optional and not their personal battle? If a teacher is enforcing alone against parent pushback, they will stop. They should not have to be brave to follow the policy. The task, the test. Ask 3 different teachers what happens when a student is caught with their phone. If you get 3 different answers, you do not have a policy. You have a preference that varies by classroom. L, leverage. Are the real consequences that actually happen? The question, does violating this policy cost the student anything? Does it escalate? And does it actually get executed? A warning is not leverage. A written consequence nobody carries out is not leverage. Leverage is a consequence that is real, that gets bigger with repetition. And that happens every time with an adult having to decide whether it is worth the hassle today. And leaders need to answer the harder question. Am I prepared for the parent calls? And will I back my staff when they come? Because if the answer is no, the consequence will quietly disappear and the policy dies with them. The test, can you name what happens on the first violation, the second, the third, and can you point to it actually happening last month? L, learning. Are we building the skill or just removing the option? The question, what is the student able to do at 3 p.m. on a weekend and at graduation? Removing the phone creates the condition for focus. It does not create the capacity for focus. Those are different. And a policy that only does the first one has protected a student for 3 years and prepared them for none in the future. This does not have to be the whole course. It could be teaching students those applications are engineered to their attention, having honest conversations about what they notice in themselves, and giving them actual strategies. But it has to be deliberate because it will not happen by accident. The test, name one thing your school does that teaches self-regulation rather than just enforcing removal. If you cannot name one, that is the gap. So how does it score? 1 all 4, solid, weak or missing on each one. Just run it. What I would predict, based on what I have seen and based on that USC compliance finding, is that many schools score reasonably on boundary because the law wrote it for them, and then fail on enforcing or leveraging, which is exactly why most students are still on their phones despite 26 states passing laws. The law can give you the B, only leaderships gives you the E and the L. Let me tell you what I actually did, including the parts that were unpleasant and gave me pushback originally. I wrote and implemented a phone policy at my school before the state of Florida required it. Not because I am ahead of the curve, but because I was watching fights get organized and I could keep telling myself it was a distraction problem. The policy itself was the easy part. Any of you could write one this afternoon. The hard part was everything after, making every adult enforce it the same way, which required training, repetition, and me backing staff publicly when they got pushback. Carrying out consequences consistently, even when it was convenient, even when it generated phone calls, even when a parent was genuinely upset and I understood why. And I want to be fair to those parents because their concern is not unreasonable. The most common objection to a phone is about emergencies. If something happens at school, a parent wants to reach their child. I'm a father. I feel that completely. And here is the honest answer. and is uncomfortable. In an actual emergency, you do not want 30 students on the phone. You want 30 students listening to the adult in the room who has information and a plan. Phones during crisis spread panic, spread misinformation, and pull attention away from the person trying to keep them alive. The school can and must have reliable way to reach families, but a student on a phone during an emergency is less safe, not more. And as someone in law enforcement, well, prior law enforcement, in my previous life, I can see it. I see it both ways. And although it's uncomfortable, it is factually true. That conversation does not always land. And some parents stayed unhappy. I still think it was right. What I got wrong early on, my consequence was not consistent enough. I let some things slide that I should not have. Usually when I was busy or when I judged the situation as minor. And students noticed that faster than I did. They always do. The moment they see the policy is applied unevenly, you are rebuilding from zero. I had to go back and reset expectations with staff and students. And that was harder than starting clean would have been. The lesson I took, and it's the same lesson from the AI policy in last week's episode, writing the policy is not the work. The policy is the easiest part of the job. The work is the thousand small moments of enforcement every day by every adult when nobody's watching, and it would be easier to let go. A mandate produces a document. Leadership produces change. That is true for the AI policy, and that is true for the phone policy. And I suspect it true for almost everything else. So, your homework, depending on who you are. If you're a school leader, run the bell. Test on your policy this week before the students arrive. Be brutal on the E and the L. Then ask 3 teachers what happens when a student is caught. If you get 3 answers, you found your gap. If you're a teacher, ask your administrator 1 question. What is the consequence, and will you back me when a parent calls? You are entitled to that answer before you ask to enforce something, anything. If you're a parent, ask the school what actual consequence is and whether it's applied consistently across every classroom. And ask what the school teaches about self-regulation. That's just what it forbids. Excuse me, not that it just forbids. And if you're a student listening, try 1 week. Genuinely try 1 week. And pay attention to what you notice about your own focus, your own mood, and your conversations at lunch. Do not take my word for it. Run the experiment and get your own data. Everyone, ask the question underneath all of this. Am I able to do this without the device? Or have I just arranged my life so I've never had to find out? So here's what we covered. 26 states now require phone restrictions. 22 of those laws passed in 2025 alone, and public support is strong and bipartisan. And despite all of it, USC study found most students are still using phones during the school day. We reframed the problem. Phones create 3 distinct issues in the school: attention, integrity, and incentive. The third one, the one where the camera and audience make cruelty profitable, is the one that nobody is naming, and is the one that turned a phone policy into a safety policy for me. And we named why bans fail. Rules with holes, inconsistent enforcement, which kills a policy instantly, consequence that exists on paper and never in practice, and confusing, removing the option with building the skill. The Bell test gives you 4 questions: boundary, enforcement, leverage, learning. And the thing I want you to take away with: the ban is not the variable. 26 states provided 26 states proved you can pass a law, only a building can make it real. Follow the show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or YouTube. That single tap is the most useful thing you can do to keep this conversation going. The Bell Test worksheet, including a parent version and a school leader audit, is free at maaponte.substack.com. Link is in the description. If you are a school or district leader who wants help building or repairing a phone policy that actually holds consulting, information is in the description. Also, think clearly, lead boldly, stay logical. I am Mike Aponte, also known as M.A. Aponte, and this is Thinking to Think. Take care, guys.